Alright, so this is about chapter 45, The Age of Anxiety, or in other words, the era when everyone loses their minds and is angry, looking for solutions. Many of them turn to some really dangerous solutions like communism and fascism, as we will learn. So, basically, the traumatic amount of loss of life and destruction caused by the First World War, which was unprecedented in all history, began to make people think. So, the sheer destruction, the loss of life, and new scientific discoveries would eventually basically made people question everything that they knew about it. Basically, everything becomes uncertain. To them, there was no objective reality. The old ways of the reason, progress were discredited and undermined. But you also had some really nice innovations. So, to highlight the pessimism after the First World War, the famous Gertrude Stein would refer to a post-war American offers as the lost generation due to their hopelessness. It describes American intellectuals who flocked to Paris seeking to find some relief from the disillusionment after World War I. All Quiet on the Western Front was an example of a work that was overflowing with images of meaningless death and suffering. Previous works had depicted war as glorious. This film depicted it as a harsh hellhole in which no one lives. Basically, pessimism took over the idea of human progress. Spengler wrote The Decline of the West, which stated that European society had entered the final stage of existence. So yeah, everyone's thinking we're screwed. There was religious uncertainty, as there was the end of belief that limitless progress was the realization of God's purpose. The ideal of science has failed, as science had been used to create some horrible inventions, like poison gas. Democracy was perceived as weak, as intellectuals saw democracy as a product of decay, i.e. being a rule of inferiors. This would lead to we can see this in the work Revolt of the Masses. So, Albert Einstein proposed new scientific discoveries will further help add to this age of anxiety and uncertainty. Albert Einstein, the famous German scientist, published his theory of relativity. It stated that neither time nor space were absolutes. It varies with the observer. To the average person, this meant that science had reached the limits of what could be known for certain. Werner Heisenberg, another German scientist, proposes his uncertainty principle, which states that it is impossible to specify simultaneously both the position and velocity of a subatomic particle. This called into question established notions of truth and violated the fundamental law of cause and effect. These concepts were extended to humanities and social sciences. For example, you can see this with Sigmund Freud. He explained that the human psychology could be described as a suppression of the subconscious mind. This repressive mechanism keeps painful memories or threatening events away from the conscious mind. He believed that dreams held the key to the deepest recesses of the human psyche. This would be applied, and of course, we have to remember, he basically said the only motivation for human beings was the sex drive, with some outrageous and outlandish fears like the Oedipus complex. His theories were applied to mythology, religion, literature, art, and etc. Psychoanalysis provided the keys to understanding all human behavior. So if you're just thinking of if you want some analogies, here you go. So photography makes realism irrelevant. What's the point of art? What's the point of making realistic art when you can just snap a picture? So artists began to see that the purpose of painting was not to mirror reality, but to create it. They retreat to abstraction. For example, we see Pablo Picasso, who was influenced by non-Western styles in creating Cubism. The definition of good and bad art had all but disappeared by the 30s. We also get the mechanization of architecture, for example, the Bauhaus, which followed the principle that the form follows function. These buildings were, these new buildings that resulted were square, lifeless, but efficient. An example would be skyscrapers, glass boxes, international style. Governments and businesses were eager to embrace the new style, but the public never really quite warmed up to it. Ah, yes, the Great Depression. So, the appearance of post-war prosperity was fragile and perhaps false. You had basically a triangle trade of money that was was basically a financial stack of cards ready to collapse at any moment. Austria and Hungary would borrow American money in order to pay war debts or reparations to France and England. France and England would then use these reparations money to pay debts owed to the USA for World War I. This system, as you can imagine, depended on flow of cash from the US. No cash from the US, everything goes to crap. And that's exactly what happened. So improvements in industrial process. So before the US economy would crash, we had to look at some other economic developments that were also creating a more fragile economic predicament. Improvements in industrial processes reduced worldwide demand for certain raw materials, causing an increase in supplies and a drop in prices. This basically ruined several single export countries' economies. For example, the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, and Ceylon were obliterated by the introduction of synthetically manufactured rubber. Of course, some historians dispute the importance of this, and others say, they say that this is really not important. Now, what we can say for sure is certain was agricultural surpluses certainly were a major factor. So, the key weakness of the global economy in the 1920s was the depressed state of agriculture, especially in the United States, a result of the overproduction and falling prices. Above average global harvest in 1925 to 1929 created food surpluses. This caused the lowest wheat prices in 400 years. This causes, as you can imagine, farm income drops, and there's a less demand for manufactured goods. Now, another thing that really, sent the economy into a tailspin was the crash of 1929. During this time, everyone in the United States would buy stocks purchased on margin. Mostly, basically, they pay, in layman's terms, they would pay for these stocks using loans. Paying as little as 3% of a stock's price with their own cash. By October 29th, 1929, there were hints of a worldwide economic slowdown and warnings from experts, causing investors to pull out of the market. This led to Black Tuesday, a wave of panic selling on the New York Stock Exchange, causing stock prices to plummet. You had millions of people's life savings were wiped out. Some investors were so upset that they committed suicide, and basically fear trumps greed. This causes a cascade chain effects of the U.S. economy collapsing, with consumer demand dropping, inventory surpluses leading to layoffs. These layoffs lead to decreased demand, so even more businesses fail. It's basically just this vicious cycle of, people, companies can't sell products, so they fire people. Now those workers can't buy products, and more business fails. Just this endless cycle. Also, you have the destruction of banks. In 1932, industrial production was half of it was in 1929. National income had dropped by approximately half. 44% of U.S. banks were out of business, as people were running to the banks to withdraw their money because they just lost their money in the stock market. Unfortunately, all the banks now went under because of the fact that they had paid out all these loans to people to buy stocks. And yet they were not being paid back. They were trying to recall those loans, and everything just goes to crap. Everyone, deposits were just entirely wiped out. There was no FDIC. The contraction of the U.S. economy created a ripple effect that circled the globe. The hardest hit were countries that depend on the export of manufactured goods for essentials, Germany and Japan. Single export countries were also severely affected, in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. As you can imagine, with lower manufacturing demand, there was also a lower demand for raw materials like coffee, sugar, and cotton, as well as minerals, ores, and rubber. Devastated by the loss of U.S. capital, the German economy experienced a steep slide that by 1932 resulted in 35% unemployment and a 50% decrease in industrial production. The rest of Europe was also closely tied to the German economy, so it also, went down the toilet. U.S. markets had virtually disappeared behind tariff walls, and eventually the retaliation committed by other countries for these tariffs, with trade dropping by as much as 66%. As international cooperation broke down, governments turned to their own resources and practiced economic nationalism, basically imposing ridiculously high tariffs. This backfired as other countries would retaliate with their own tariffs, thus leading to a drastic decline in global trade. Governments were desperate, so they tried, for example, removing women from the workforce. Of course, this doesn't help, and, you get shanty towns, breadlands, class wars, and non-existent job markets. In the U.S., farmers got the crazy notion of plant scarcity, in which they would burn vegetables, fruits, and animals in order to raised prices while the citizens starved. You can see this in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. So, previously most countries had approached their economy with a laissez-faire or planned scarcity approach, of laissez-faire as well as planned scarcity. These approaches absolutely fail. John Maynard Keynes, an economist, proposes a new solution for a new form of economics, Keynesian economics. He advocated for the stimulation of the economy by increasing the money supply, lowering interest rates, and encouraging investment. He also advocated for public works projects in order to increase government budget. This would end up increasing budget deficits, but he believed it as necessary in order to alleviate economic ills. The New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt would attempt something along the lines of Keynesian economics. Basically, it was justified in the fact that it stated the government was justified in intervening to protect the social and economic welfare of the people. Now, the New Deal was not enough to compensate. Historians debate on how much, whether it should have gone farther or gone less. However, what really did boost the U.S. economy was World War II spending. With the failure of democracy and of liberal democracy and capitalism, people start turning to some radical notions. For example, communism in Russia. After seizing power, Vladimir Lenin had to defend the world's first dictatorship of the proletariat against dissident socialists, anti-Bolshevik officers and troops, peasant bands, and foreign military forces. He instigated the Red Terror, which ends up killing the Tsar and 200,000 others. Of course, Bolshevik rule ends up instigating a civil war that would last from 1918 to 1920, killing 10 million Russians. It would pit the Reds, the communists, versus the Whites, the anti-communists. Russia's former allies would send troops and supplies to aid the White forces. Of course, the Whites were eventually defeated by the Red Army in 1920. Now, Lenin initiated war communism. This basically was, hasty and unplanned course of nationalization. It officially annulled private property and confiscated everyone's stuff. It was unsurprisingly massively unpopular, and so Lenin backtracks it in 1921, and instead replaces with a new economic policy, which instituted partial reprivatization of the economy. Large industries, banks, and transportation and communication facilities remained under state control, but the government returned small-scale industries to private ownership. Peasants could sell their surpluses at free market prices. Of course, this all gets thrown out the window with Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin is not his real name. He's actually, his actual name is just really long Georgian name. He instead just, renames himself so that, it's Stalin just because Stalin means man of steel. He repudiated the role of the USSR as a torchbearer of the worldwide socialist revolution and instead focused on socialism in one country. He replaces the NEP with the first 5-year plan. Basically, the 5-year plans are government plans government controlled plans in order to push the economy in a certain way. The 5-year plan, led the transition from a predominantly agricultural country to a leading industrial power. It emphasized heavy industry like steel and machinery, however, it did not place any emphasis on consumer goods. It called for the massive collectivization of agriculture as a means of increasing the efficiency of agricultural production and ensuring that industrial workers would be fed. Of course, collectivization was opposed by the kulaks, or wealthy peasants, who had risen to prosperity during the NEP. These outraged peasants were basically just liquidated and the crops burned. Millions of farmers left the land for search of jobs in the cities. Of course, people starved due to collectivized agriculture because instead of improving efficiency of agriculture, it absolutely just sends it into it absolutely just tanks its efficiency, because once everyone is a farmer and is hired by the state, there's no competition to actually be efficient. As you can, this, starvation and Stalin's own paranoia would end up leading. Stalin's, maniacal, heartless policies would end up killing millions of people. Now, despite the scarcity or non-existence of consumer goods, this was balanced by full employment, low-cost utilities, and, when available, cheap housing and food. Now, of course, we can't talk about Stalin without his paranoia. Between 1945 and 1938, Stalin removed from posts of authority all persons suspected of opposition. Victims faced execution or long-term suffering in labor camps, or gulags. This was conducted on a massive scale. 8 million Soviet citizens were in labor camps and 3 million were dead by 1939. The army was also greatly weakened because Stalin purged the officer corps. That will end up being a really bad decision later on because, once you lose all your best officers and replace them with awful political cronies, you really don't have a good army. Now, fascism developed as a reaction against both liberal democracy and communism. It originated with Benito Mussolini, and it would go on to influence Europe, Asia, Latin America, but remain primarily a European phenomenon of the era between the two world wars. Now, fascism is hard to define. However, these are generally some core principles. It emphasized primacy of state over individual, distrust of democracy, hostility to communism, hyper/ultra nationalism, militarism, and a charismatic leader, strongman that must be given absolute power in order to lead the people to glory. Now, the post-World War I Italian government was hilariously ineffective. This didn't help. It didn't help the fact that the public was also disappointed with weak territorial gains. You also had economic and social turmoil. Mussolini, a former newspaper editor, managed to gain some electoral success in 1921. He marches on Rome in October and forces King Emmanuel III to offer him the office of Prime Minister. In 1926, he seizes total power as Il Duce, or the leader. He eliminated all other political parties, curbed freedom of the press, and outlawed freedom of free speech and association. He also crushed labor unions and prohibited strikes, despite the fact Mussolini used to be a socialist himself. Now, in 1938, the government suddenly issued anti-Semitic laws, possibly influenced by Hitler. Mussolini would later go on to pass legislation that basically relegated Africans under Italian rule, like Libyans and Ethiopians, second-class citizens. In 1949, he signs the Pact of Steel, the Nazis. Now, of course, we can't talk about fascism without talking about Adolf Hitler, the infamous evil man who would end up, killing millions in his own disgusting, nationalist glory. In 1921, he becomes the chairman of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis. This is basically an abbreviation for the insanely long German name. He attempts to overthrow the government in a beer hall putsch in 1923. It ends up being a total joke and a failure. He writes an autobiography, Mein Kampf, in jail. It was massively popular despite its, incoherence. What a surprise. He capitalizes on public discontent with the post-war era and especially the U.S. cause of the Great Depression. He rails against the war guilt clause, reparation payments, and the inability of major parties to come to a consensus. He also incites hatred of Jews, blaming them falsely for profiting off the war and stabbing Germany in the back. Now, the Nazis began to consolidate their power. They would become the single largest party in the parliament from the 1930 to 1932 because of 35% unemployment. It also didn't help that the weak President Paul von Hindenburg appoints Hitler as Chancellor. While as Chancellor, Hitler suppresses opposition, abolishes constitutional and civil rights. He also makes the Nazis the sole legal party. He also destroys trade unions and purges the judiciary and civil service of perceived enemies. Of course, he can justify all this when the German Reichstag building burns down, and he blames it on the communists. He cites falsely that Germany is about to be destroyed by a communist plot, and therefore he must be given absolute power to save it from its destruction. Now, of course, the Nazis were incredibly racist. They created what we now call the racial state. It was all based on theories of racial superiority and racial purity. They pursued policies of eugenics, in conducting compulsory sterilization of 30,000 Germans. They made abortions illegal for healthy Germans and mandatory for hereditary ill people and racial aliens. Hitler and the Nazis also institute a euthanasia program that kills 200,000 people with physical or mental handicaps between 1940 and 1945. This would end up becoming a precursor to the massacre of Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, homosexuals, and other minorities that the Nazis would end up conducting. Now, anti-Semitism was influenced by 19th century biological racism, but also used religious descent to determine who was a Jew. The Nazis passed the Nuremberg laws in 1935. These prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews, removed Jews from civil service and schools, and liquidated Jewish-owned businesses and purchased by non-Jew and mandated that they be purchased by non-Jews. Basically, the Nazis' initial goal was to basically just evict all the Jews. We can see an example of this with Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. This was basically a massive countrywide pogrom on Jews from November 9th, on the night of November 9th to November 10th of 1938. Yeah, ugly stuff. Thank you. And, as you can imagine, this will lead to some horrible, atrocities later on.